Mark Thompson was a man who lived life one day at a time. He worked as a janitor at Apex Tech, a big tech company in the city that everyone seemed to talk about. Mark didn't have much. His apartment was small, his car was old, and he often had to stretch his paycheck just to make ends meet. But there was one thing he had plenty of: love for his daughter. Emily was 12 years old, full of energy, and had a smile that could light up even the darkest room. Losing her mother 5 years ago had been hard on both of them, but Mark promised himself every single day that he would do everything in his power to give her a good life. No matter how tough things got, he wanted Emily to know she was loved more than anything else in this world. Every morning, Mark would wake up early to pack Emily's lunch before heading off to clean offices at Apex Tech. Most nights he wouldn't get home until late, but he always made sure to check in with her before bed. Sometimes they'd sit together on the couch, eating popcorn and watching movies. Other times they'd talk about school or share silly jokes. These moments were precious to Mark because they reminded him why he worked so hard, but lately something had changed. Emily wasn't her usual bubbly self anymore. She seemed quieter, distracted, and sometimes even sad. At first, Mark thought, maybe it was just a phase. Kids go through ups and downs all the time, right? But when he asked her what was wrong, she shrugged and said nothing. That worried him more than anything. One evening after coming home from work, Mark found Emily sitting alone in her room, staring at her phone. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly, sitting beside her. "What's going on?" Emily hesitated, clutching her phone tightly. After a long pause, she finally broke down. Through tears, she told Mark about the bullying she'd been facing at school. It started with mean comments about her clothes, how they weren't cool enough, how they looked weird. Then it escalated. One of her classmates took a picture of her during gym class when her shirt accidentally rode up, showing part of her stomach. They posted it online with cruel captions, calling her names and making fun of her. "I tried telling the teacher," Emily sniffled, wiping her face with her sleeve, "but they said it wasn't a big deal. They said I should." Ignore it. Mark felt a knot tighten in his chest. How could anyone say these things to a child? And how could the school dismiss it like it didn't matter? He pulled Emily close, hugging her tightly. "You didn't do anything wrong, okay?" he whispered. "None of this is your fault." That night, Mark couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. He knew he couldn't let this slide, not when it was hurting Emily so deeply. So the next morning, he called the school principal and scheduled a meeting. When he arrived, he explained everything Emily had told him: the teasing, the photo, the lack of action from teachers. But instead of getting help, he was met with excuses. "It's just kids being kids," the principal said dismissively. "We can't control everything they say or do." Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. Wasn't it their job to protect students? Frustrated but determined, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Someone had to stand up for Emily, and if no one else would, then it had to be him. A friend at work mentioned small claims court, a system designed for people without access to expensive lawyers. Mark had never been inside a courtroom before, but he figured it couldn't hurt to try. If nothing else, it might send a message that what happened to Emily wasn't acceptable. For weeks, Mark spent every spare moment preparing for the case. He gathered evidence, screenshots of the hateful posts, emails he'd sent to the school asking for help, notes from conversations with teachers. He practiced what he would say in front of the mirror, rehearsing until he felt confident enough to speak clearly and calmly. This wasn't just about winning. It was about showing Emily that she deserved to be treated with respect. As the court date approached, Mark grew increasingly nervous. What if he messed up? What if the judge didn't believe him? Worst of all, what if standing up caused problems? At work, everyone knew Richard Langley, the CEO of Apex Tech, was powerful and ruthless. Mark cleaned his office floors every night. The last thing he needed was to lose his job over this. Still, Mark reminded himself why he was doing this. Every time doubt crept in, he thought of Emily's tear-streaked face and the way she used to laugh before all of this started. He owed it to her to try. No matter what happened, he knew he'd done the right thing by speaking up. The morning of the trial, Mark put on his best suit, a hand-me-down from a cousin that he'd patched up himself. As he stood outside the courthouse, taking deep breaths. To calm his nerves, he realized something important. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about proving that kindness mattered more than money, that standing up for what's right was worth any risk. With that thought in mind, Mark walked through the doors of the courtroom, ready to face whatever came next. The courtroom felt like a different world to Mark. It was quiet, almost too quiet, with rows of wooden benches and walls painted in dull shades of gray. The air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, and the echo of footsteps seemed louder than they should be. Mark sat on one side of the aisle, gripping a folder filled with evidence he'd worked so hard to gather. Across from him, on the other side of the room, sat Richard Langley, the CEO of Apex Tech, and his team of expensive lawyers. Mark couldn't help but notice the contrast between them. While he wore his patched-up suit, Richard looked every bit the part of a powerful businessman. His tailored jacket fit perfectly, and his shiny shoes reflected the light like mirrors. Flanking him were two attorneys dressed in dark suits, their faces unreadable behind thick glasses and stern expressions. They whispered to each other occasionally, glancing at Mark as if sizing him up. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood up. As the proceedings began, Mark tried to focus on what mattered most, standing up for Emily, but it wasn't easy. Every time he looked across the aisle, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was outmatched. Richard's presence loomed large, not just because of his wealth or position, but because Mark knew how much power the man held over his life. He cleaned Richard's office floors every night. What would happen if he lost this case? Would Richard fire him? Make his life even harder? Despite the fear gnawing at him, Mark reminded himself why he was here. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about showing Emily that she deserved better. So, when the judge called his name, asking him to present his case, Mark took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I'm not a lawyer," he started, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside him. "I don't know all the fancy words or rules you might hear in courtrooms like this, but I do know my daughter and I know what's right." He opened the folder and laid out the screenshots of the cruel post targeting Emily, one by one. He explained how each comment had hurt her. There was the photo taken without her permission, mocking her appearance. Then came the endless stream of insults, calling her names and making fun of her clothes. Mark pointed out how the bullying had spiraled out of control, affecting Emily's confidence and happiness. She stopped smiling, Mark said, his voice cracking slightly. She used to laugh all the time, play sports, hang out with friends, but now she comes home crying because kids won't leave her alone. And when I went to the school for help, they told me it wasn't serious enough to do anything about. The judge listened intently, nodding occasionally as Mark spoke. For the first time since stepping into the courtroom, Mark felt a flicker of hope. Maybe someone was actually listening. Maybe this wasn't a waste of time after all. When it was Richard's turn to speak, his attorney rose confidently. "Your Honor," he began, his tone smooth and practiced, "while we acknowledge the unfortunate circumstances surrounding this matter, it's important to note that our client's son is merely a child. Children make mistakes. It's part of growing up. To hold him accountable in such a manner is excessive." Mark clenched his fists under the table. How could they dismiss this so easily? Those mistakes weren't harmless pranks. They were deliberate acts, meant to humiliate and hurt Emily. But before he could react, Richard himself leaned forward, signaling his lawyer to pause. "Let me address this directly," Richard sighed, standing up. His voice carried authority, commanding attention from everyone in the room. "Mr. Thompson, I want to apologize for the pain caused to your daughter. My son has been reprimanded, and steps are being taken to ensure this behavior doesn't continue." Mark blinked, unsure of what to say. An apology from Richard Langley? It sounded sincere, but Mark couldn't tell if it was genuine or just another tactic to avoid consequences. Still, he nodded politely, choosing to wait and see where this was going. After hours of testimony and arguments, the judge finally announced a recess to deliberate. Mark sat back down, feeling drained but determined. He glanced around the room, noticing the curious stares of spectators who had gathered to watch the unusual showdown between a janitor and a CEO. Some looked sympathetic, while others seemed skeptical. Either way, Mark didn't care. All he cared about was doing right by Emily as they waited for the verdict. Mark's mind wandered back to the countless nights he'd spent cleaning offices at Apex Tech. He remembered walking past Richard's desk, seeing the framed photos of his family, a wife, 2 kids, and a golden retriever. At the time, Mark had envied the picture-perfect life captured in those images. Now, sitting here in court, he wondered if Richard ever thought about the people working behind the scenes to keep his company running smoothly. Did he realize how much stress his decisions impacted employees like Mark? Finally, the judge returned, calling the courtroom to order. Mark straightened up, bracing himself for whatever came next. The judge cleared his throat and began reading the verdict aloud. Based on the evidence presented, the judge said, "It is clear that emotional distress was inflicted upon the plaintiff's daughter due to repeated instances of bullying. Therefore, the defendant will issue a formal public apology and pay damages for the harm caused. Additionally, the school district involved will implement stricter anti-bullying measures moving forward." The room erupted into murmurs. People clapped quietly, some cheering openly. Mark exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. He hadn't expected to win, especially against someone as influential as Richard Langley. Yet here he was, victorious not just for himself, but for Emily. But the real surprise came moments later as everyone prepared to leave. Instead of storming out angrily, Richard approached Mark, extending his hand. "You've got guts," Richard said, his tone gruff but respectful. "Not many people stand up to me like that." Mark hesitated for a second before shaking Richard's hand. "I wasn't trying to stand up to you," he replied honestly. "I was standing up for my daughter." Richard studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough," he said. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Mark wondering what if anything this encounter meant for the future. For now, though, Mark allowed himself a small smile. He'd done it. He'd stood up, fought back, and won. And most importantly, he'd shown Emily that no matter how tough things got, she'd always have someone in her corner fighting for her. The courtroom verdict was a turning point, but Mark didn't have much time to celebrate. As he walked out of the building, still clutching the folder with all his notes and evidence, his mind was racing. Sure, he'd won the case and justice had been served for Emily, but what came next? Richard Langley wasn't just any ordinary person. He was the CEO of Apex Tech, the very company where Mark worked as a janitor. The man who held Mark's job in his hands. For days after the trial, Mark couldn't shake off the feeling that something big was about to happen. He kept replaying the moment when Richard shook his hand and said, "You've got guts." It sounded sincere enough, but Mark knew better than to trust appearances. People like Richard didn't get to the top by being soft or forgiving. What if this whole apology thing was just a show? A way to save face in public while plotting revenge behind the scenes? At work, things felt different. Mark noticed it right away. His coworkers whispered among themselves whenever he passed by. Some gave him sympathetic looks, while others seemed almost impressed. Even his supervisor, Mr. Harris, who usually barked orders without making eye contact, stopped him one evening to say, "Heard about what happened, Mark. Good for you." Mark nodded politely but didn't say much. He appreciated the support, but he couldn't let himself get too comfortable, not yet. Every night, as he cleaned the floors and emptied trash bins, he half expected someone from HR to call him into an office and hand him a termination letter. After all, standing up to the boss even indirectly wasn't exactly a recipe for job security. But then, something unexpected happened one Friday evening. As Mark was finishing up his shift, he received an email from the corporate office. His stomach dropped as he opened it on his phone. The subject line read, "Meeting request, Monday morning." Mark stared at the screen, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading. They were finally going to fire him. When Monday morning arrived, Mark walked into the conference room feeling like he was heading to his own execution. Sitting at the head of the table was none other than Richard Langley himself. Mark swallowed hard and took a seat, bracing himself for whatever was coming. Mark, Richard began, leaning back in his chair. I'll get straight to the point. You surprised me in court. Most people wouldn't dare stand up to someone like me. Hell, most people wouldn't even think about it, but you did. Mark stayed silent, unsure of where this was going. Was Richard trying to intimidate him? Or was this some kind of twisted game? I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Richard continued. About standing up for your daughter. About doing what's right no matter the cost. And honestly, it made me reflect on my own life. On the kind of father I'm, or maybe haven't been to my kids. Mark blinked, caught off guard. Richard sounded sincere, almost vulnerable. It was strange hearing someone so powerful talk like this. Here's the thing, Richard went on. What happened with your daughter, it hit close to home for me. I was bullied as a kid, you know. No one ever stood up for me back then. I learned early on that the world doesn't care about weakness, so I built walls around myself. Worked hard, climbed the ladder, became the guy everyone either fears or respects. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what really matters. Mark listened intently, his initial fear slowly giving way to curiosity. Could it be true? Was Richard actually opening up to him? That's why I wanted to meet with you today, Richard said, sitting forward now. First, I want to apologize not just for my son's actions, but for how I've treated people over the years, including employees like you. I've been unfair, dismissive, and frankly blind to the struggles of others. That ends now. Mark raised an eyebrow, still skeptical. What does that mean, exactly? He asked cautiously. Richard smiled faintly. It means change. Starting today, you're no longer a janitor. You're our new facilities manager. Better pay, benefits, and a real voice in how things run around here. I need someone like you, someone who understands hard work and integrity to help me turn this place around. Mark's jaw dropped. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Him? A facilities manager? It sounded too good to be true. Why me? He asked finally. There are plenty of people more qualified than I am. That's exactly why, Richard replied. You don't have fancy degrees or connections. You earned this through grit and courage. Qualifications can be taught. Character can't. Besides, I figure if anyone knows what it's like to be overlooked, it's you. Who better to make sure no one else feels that way? Mark sat there, stunned. Part of him wanted to refuse it, felt surreal, almost dreamlike. But another part of him realized this could be the opportunity of a lifetime. Not just for him, but for Emily too. With a steady income and benefits, they could finally breathe a little easier. They could focus on rebuilding their lives instead of constantly worrying about money. Okay, Mark said finally, nodding slowly. I'll do it, but on one condition. What's that? Richard asked, raising an eyebrow. That we start treating people with respect, from the janitors to the executives. Everyone deserves a fair shot. Richard smiled, looking genuinely pleased. Deal. As Mark left the meeting, his mind buzzed with excitement and disbelief. He couldn't wait to tell Emily the news. For the first time in years, he felt hopeful about the future. Things weren't perfect, they never would be, but maybe, just maybe, they were finally moving in the right direction. Little did Mark know, this was only the beginning. Richard's apology wasn't just lip service. It was the start of something bigger, something that would ripple far beyond the walls of Apex Tech. Mark's new role as facilities manager came with a lot of changes, not just for him, but for everyone at Apex Tech. At first, his coworkers were skeptical. Some thought it was too good to be true that a janitor could climb the ranks so quickly. Others whispered that Richard Langley must have had some hidden agenda. But Mark didn't let the gossip bother him. He knew he hadn't asked for this promotion. It had been given to him because Richard saw something in him, something real. His first day in the new position started early. Instead of grabbing his mop and bucket like usual, Mark walked into a small office with a desk, a computer, and even a nameplate on the door, Facilities Manager, Mark Thompson. It felt strange, seeing his name written formally like that. For years he'd been known simply as the guy who cleans up. Now people looked at him differently, as someone with authority, someone whose opinion mattered, but Mark didn't want to lose sight of where he came from. He made it a point to spend part of his day walking through the building, checking in with the cleaning staff and maintenance crew. He remembered what it was like to feel invisible, to work long hours without anyone noticing your effort. So he made sure to notice theirs. Whether it was thanking Maria for her attention to detail or asking Joe how his son was doing in college, Mark went out of his way to connect with people. Slowly but surely, the skepticism began to fade, replaced by respect. Meanwhile, Richard kept his promise to make bigger changes at Apex Tech. One afternoon, Mark was called to a meeting with Richard and a few other senior leaders. The topic? A new initiative aimed at creating a more compassionate workplace culture. Richard explained that he wanted to lead by example, not just within the company but in the community too. "I've been thinking about what you said, Mark," Richard told him during the meeting, "about treating everyone with respect. I realized we can't just talk about it, we need to act on it." The plan was ambitious. They would launch a program to support employees facing personal challenges, whether it was financial hardship, health issues, or family problems. There would also be workshops on empathy and leadership, open to everyone from interns to executives. And perhaps most surprising of all, Richard announced that he would personally visit each department once a month to hear feedback directly from the staff. At first, many employees assumed this was just another PR stunt. But as weeks turned into months, they began to see real results. Workers who had struggled silently for years suddenly had access to resources they never knew existed. Managers started holding regular check-ins with their teams, not just to discuss performance, but to ask how people were really doing. Even the break rooms got a makeover with fresh paint, comfy chairs, and free coffee that tasted better than the old instant stuff. For Mark, the biggest change came when Richard approached him with an idea that seemed almost unbelievable. "I've been thinking," Richard said one evening as they stood near the vending machines. "Your daughter went through something terrible because of bullying. What if we used our platform to help prevent that from happening to others?" Mark frowned, unsure of what Richard meant. "What are you suggesting?" Richard leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "We create a foundation, something big, a movement to combat bullying in schools. We'll fund programs, host events, bring in experts. It'll be nationwide. And we'll name it after your daughter." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Naming. A foundation after Emily? It sounded incredible, but also overwhelming. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dead serious," Richard replied. "You showed me the importance of standing up for what's right. Let's take that lesson and spread it as far as we can." Over the next few weeks, plans for the foundation took shape. Mark worked closely with Richard and a team of professionals to design programs that would educate students, teachers, and parents about bullying. They partnered with local schools to pilot anti-bullying workshops and created online resources for families struggling to deal with similar situations. The response was overwhelming. Teachers praised the initiative, saying it filled a gap they desperately needed. Parents thanked Mark and Richard for shining a light on an issue that often went ignored. As word of the foundation spread, media outlets picked up the story. Reporters wanted to interview Mark, calling him a hero for taking on a powerful CEO and winning. At first, Mark hesitated. He didn't see himself as a hero, he was just a dad trying to protect his daughter. But Richard encouraged him to share their story. "People need to hear it," Richard said. "They need to know that change is possible even when it feels impossible." So Mark agreed. He sat down with journalists, recounting everything from the bullying incident to the courtroom battle to the unlikely friendship he'd formed with Richard. Each time he spoke, he emphasized the same message: kindness matters. Standing up for what's right matters. No matter who you are or you come from, you have the power to make a difference. The interviews resonated with viewers across the country. Parents reached out to thank Mark for inspiring them to advocate for their own children. Students wrote letters sharing their experiences with bullying and expressing gratitude for the foundation's efforts. Teachers implemented the workshop materials in their classrooms, reporting improvements in student behavior almost immediately. Back home, Emily noticed the shift too. She wasn't fully healed from the pain she'd endured, but she felt stronger, knowing her dad had fought so hard for her. When Mark told her about the foundation being named after her, she teared up. "Me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why me?" "Because you're brave," Mark said, pulling her into a hug. "Maybe you don't see it yet, kiddo, but you inspire people. You always have." As the months passed, Mark found himself growing, closer to Richard in ways he never expected. Their relationship evolved from employer-employee to something resembling friendship. Richard often stopped by Mark's office to chat, not about work but about life. He talked about his struggles as a father, admitting he hadn't always been there for his kids. "I'm trying to do better," he confessed one evening. "But it's not easy," Mark nodded, understanding completely. "It never is," he said, "but every little bit helps." Together, they navigated the challenges of running a massive corporation while staying true to their mission of compassion and accountability. Mark introduced Richard to the realities of working-class life, showing him how small gestures like paying employees fair wages or providing flexible schedules could transform lives. In return, Richard taught Mark about leadership and decision-making, encouraging him to trust his instincts. Despite their differences, they balanced each other out. Where Richard was bold and decisive, Mark was thoughtful and empathetic. Together, they proved that two people from opposite ends of the spectrum could come together to create something meaningful. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. There were moments of tension, especially when Richard's old habits threatened to resurface. Once, during a particularly stressful week, Richard snapped at an assistant over a minor mistake. Later that evening, Mark pulled him aside. "Hey," he said gently, "remember what we talked about? Treating people with respect?" Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're right. I messed up." "It happens," Mark replied. "Just don't let it happen again." By holding each other accountable, they ensured that the values they preached weren't just empty words, they were actions. As the foundation gained momentum, Mark and Emily became its faces. They traveled to schools, speaking at assemblies and meeting with students who were eager to learn how to stand up against bullying. Emily, once shy and withdrawn, blossomed into a confident advocate. She shared her story openly, urging others to speak out if they were being mistreated. Watching her grow into such a strong young woman filled Mark with pride. Through it all, Mark remained grounded. Despite the accolades and attention, he stayed focused on what truly mattered, making life better for people like Emily and like himself. He knew that success wasn't measured by titles or wealth, but by the impact you had on those around you. And as he looked back on everything that had happened from the courtroom victory to the birth of the foundation, Mark realized something important. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage can spark the biggest changes. By the time the foundation reached its one-year anniversary, it had become more than just a program, it was a movement. Schools across the country were adopting its workshops and resources, and communities were coming together to address bullying. In meaningful ways, the impact was undeniable. Teachers reported fewer incidents of harassment in classrooms. Parents felt empowered to speak up when their children struggled. And most importantly, kids like Emily were finding their voices, learning that they didn't have to suffer in silence. Mark couldn't believe how far they'd come. When he first stood in that courtroom, all he wanted was for his daughter to feel safe again. Now he was helping thousands of families do the same. It wasn't easy. There were long hours, tough decisions, and moments when doubt crept in, but every time he saw a child smile or heard a parent say, "Thank you," he knew it was worth it. Emily had transformed too. Gone was the quiet, withdrawn girl who used to hide in her room after school. In her place was a confident teenager who spoke passionately about kindness and resilience. She became a role model for other students, sharing her story at conferences and community events. People admired her courage, but what touched Mark the most was seeing how much she believed in herself now. She wasn't defined by what others had said about her. She was defining her own future. One evening, as Mark and Emily sat on the couch watching TV, Emily turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," she said, "do you think we've done enough?" Mark chuckled softly, setting aside the remote. "Enough? Kiddo, I don't think we'll ever be done. There's always more work to do. But look at everything we've accomplished already. We've helped so many people and we're not stopping anytime soon. Emily nodded, smiling faintly. I guess you're right, it just feels big, you. No, like this whole thing started because of me, but now it's bigger than both of us? That's a good thing, Mark replied, leaning back against the cushions. It means we're making a real difference. And hey, if it gets overwhelming, we can always take a step back and remember why we started. As the months went by, Richard continued to play an active role in the foundation. He attended events, gave speeches, and even visited schools to talk to students about empathy and accountability. At first, some people were skeptical of his involvement. After all, this was the same man who once ruled Apex Tech with an iron fist. But over time, they began to see a different side of him, a softer, more reflective version of the CEO everyone thought they knew. Richard's transformation didn't stop there. He made changes within the company too, pushing for policies that prioritized employee well-being. Flexibility became the norm, allowing workers to balance their jobs with family responsibilities. Mental health days were introduced, giving employees permission to take care of themselves without fear of judgment. Even the break rooms got another upgrade with plants, artwork, and cozy seating areas designed to make people feel valued. For Mark, working alongside Richard had been a journey of mutual growth. They challenged each other, held each other accountable, and learned from one another. Mark taught Richard the importance of humility and connection, while Richard showed Mark the power of leadership and vision. Together, they proved that change was possible even for someone as stubborn as Richard Langley, but perhaps the most surprising development was the bond they formed outside of work. On weekends, Richard would sometimes join Mark and Emily for dinner at their apartment. At first, it felt strange having the CEO of Apex Tech sitting at their kitchen table, eating spaghetti off mismatched plates. But as conversations flowed and laughter filled the room, the awkwardness faded. Richard joked about his lack of cooking skills, while Emily teased him for using too much salt. For Mark, these moments reminded him that beneath the suits and titles, they were all just people trying to do their best. The foundation also brought unexpected opportunities for Mark. Local leaders invited him to speak at town hall meetings, praising his efforts to create safer environments for children. Community organizations awarded him for his dedication to social justice. And parents reached out regularly, asking for advice on how to navigate similar challenges with their own kids. Through it all, Mark stayed humble. He never forgot where he came from, the nights spent mopping floors, the struggle to make ends meet, the love that drove him to fight for Emily. Those experiences shaped him into the person he was today, and he carried them with him wherever he went. One day, during a visit to a middle school, Mark found himself standing in front of a packed auditorium. Students filled the seats, their faces eager and curious. As he stepped up to the microphone, he paused for a moment, taking in the scene. This was what it was all about, not fame or recognition, but reaching people who needed hope. When I was growing up, Mark began, his voice steady and warm, I didn't have much. My family worked hard, but life wasn't always easy. What kept us going was knowing we had each other. Love, that's what matters most. No matter what happens, no matter how tough things get, don't forget that you're loved. He went on to share Emily's story, emphasizing the importance of speaking up and standing strong. By the time he finished, the room erupted in applause. Students lined up afterward to shake his hand, ask questions, or simply thank him for coming. One boy, barely taller than the podium, approached shyly. Mr. Thompson, he said, clutching a notebook, I just wanted to say, you're my hero. Mark knelt down to meet the boy's eyes. You don't need heroes, he said gently. All you need is courage. Be brave, okay? That's all it takes. As the years passed, the ripple effects of Mark and Richard's partnership continued to spread. Other companies followed Apex Tech's lead, implementing programs to support their employees' mental health and well-being. Anti-bullying campaigns popped up nationwide, inspired by the foundation's success. And families everywhere found strength in knowing they weren't alone. Looking back, Mark realized that none of this would have happened if he hadn't taken that first step. Standing up in court wasn't just about protecting Emily, it was about proving that anyone could make a difference, no matter their background or circumstances. Whether you were a janitor or a CEO, your actions mattered. Your voice mattered. In the end, the story of Mark Thompson wasn't just about one man's fight for justice. It was about redemption, resilience, and the power of compassion. It was about showing the world that kindness could conquer cruelty, that empathy could bridge divides, and that even the smallest acts of courage could spark the biggest changes. And as Mark watched Emily graduate from middle school with her head held high and a bright future ahead, he knew they'd done something truly special. They hadn't just changed their own lives. They'd changed countless others too.